3,000 years ago, a war ended, a city burned, and a man began a journey home that should have taken weeks. It took him 10 years. Along the way, he would blind a giant, resist the songs of monsters, walk into the land of the dead, and lose every single one of his men. When he finally returned, no one recognized him. Not his wife, not his son, not even his own dog, except for one. This is not just an adventure story. It is the story that taught the Western world what it means to be clever instead of strong, to endure instead of conquer, and to want, more than anything else, simply to go home. This is the Odyssey, and this is the story of how one blind poet, if he even existed at all, gave an entire civilization its first mirror. To understand the Odyssey, we have to go back further than the poem itself, back to a world that had already collapsed by the time anyone wrote it down. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to a network of interconnected kingdoms: Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, New Kingdom Egypt, and the trading city of Troy. Sitting at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the gateway between Europe and Asia. These civilizations wrote in clay, fought in bronze, and traded across a sea busier than most people imagine. And then, within a span of only a few decades, nearly all of them fell. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Cities were burned, trade routes vanished, writing itself disappeared from Greece for nearly 400 years. We still don't fully know why. A combination of invasions, climate shifts, famine, and internal revolt is the leading theory. But the truth is that an entire interconnected world simply stopped working, all at once. Greece entered what historians once called a dark age. No monumental architecture, no written records, just small, scattered communities, rebuilding from nothing. But something did survive the collapse, something that didn't need clay tablets or palace scribes. It survived in memory, in performance, in song. For centuries, professional singers called Aoidoi traveled from village to village, reciting epic poetry from memory, thousands upon thousands of lines, passed down and reshaped generation after generation without ever being written. This was oral tradition, not sloppy folklore, but a highly disciplined art form, built on repeated formulas, rhythmic patterns, and stock phrases. The wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles, phrases that weren't just poetic flourishes. They were memory tools, building blocks a singer could use to construct 24 books of poetry on the spot, night after night, never reciting it exactly the same way twice. By the time these stories were finally written down, sometime around the 8th century BCE, as Greece was inventing its own alphabet, adapted from Phoenician traders, they were already ancient, already reshaped by hundreds of years of retelling, already half history, half myth, fused so tightly together that separating the two would become one of the great unsolved puzzles of classical scholarship. That fusion has a name: Homer. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't actually know if Homer existed. Ancient Greeks themselves debated it. 7 different cities claimed to be his birthplace. Some ancient scholars argued the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by 2 different poets, centuries apart, simply attributed to the same legendary name. Others believed Homer wasn't a person at all, but a guild, a school, or even a title. Something like the compiler, passed down among generations of oral poets. What we can say with more confidence is this: the Iliad and the Odyssey as we have them were almost certainly the product of an oral tradition stretching back centuries, crystallized into fixed written form around the 8th century BCE, somewhere in Ionia, the Greek-speaking coast of what is now western Turkey. In the 20th century, two American scholars, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, changed how we understand this process entirely. They traveled to the Balkans, where illiterate oral poets were still composing epic songs live, night after night, using the exact same technique scholars had found buried in Homer's Greek. Repeated epithets, modular scenes, formulaic structures. Structures that let a performer improvise thousands of lines without ever writing a word down. Parry and Lord didn't just theorize about how Homer might have worked. They found living proof that it was possible. So when we say Homer, we're not necessarily talking about one blind poet sitting down with a stylus. We're talking about the final form of a tradition. Centuries of Greek memory, compressed into 24 books. Crystallizing at the exact moment, Greece was learning to write again. And that timing matters. The Odyssey isn't just a story. It's one of the first things a newly literate civilization chose to preserve forever. The Odyssey doesn't start at the beginning. Homer's audience already knew the beginning, so well that he could skip it entirely. The story assumes you already know about the 10-year Trojan War, how a Trojan prince named Paris took Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, back to Troy. Whether by seduction or abduction, the sources disagree. How Menelaus' brother, Agamemnon, assembled a coalition of Greek kings to sail across the Aegean and take her back by force. How the war dragged on for a decade outside Troy's walls, fought by heroes like Achilles, Ajax, and, central to our story, a minor king from a rocky island called Ithaca, Odysseus. Odysseus wasn't the strongest Greek at Troy. That was Achilles. He wasn't the most heroic in the traditional sense. What made Odysseus different? What the Greeks called METIS was cunning, strategic intelligence. He is, according to legend, the one who conceived the plan that finally ended the 10-year siege. A massive wooden horse, left as a fake offering outside Troy's gates, hiding Greek soldiers inside. The Trojans wheeled it into their own city as a trophy. That night, the soldiers climbed out, opened the gates, and Troy burned. It's worth pausing here, because this detail, the Trojan horse, is one of the most famous stories in human history, and it doesn't appear in the Iliad at all. The Iliad ends before the horse is even built. We know the story of the horse primarily from later sources, brief mentions in the Odyssey itself, and a fuller account centuries later in Virgil's Aeneid. This is a perfect example of how much of Greek mythology as we know it today isn't from one single source, but stitched together from a wide, overlapping tradition, of which Homer's two epics are only the most famous surviving fragment. The war was won, and for most of the Greek kings who survived it, going home should have been simple. For Odysseus, it would take another decade. The Odyssey opens not with Odysseus, but with his household falling apart in his absence. 20 years have now passed since he left for war. 10 fighting at Troy, and 10 more, unaccounted for. His wife, Penelope, is besieged by over 100 suitors, camped in his own halls. Eating his cattle, drinking his wine, and pressuring her to remarry, convinced Odysseus is dead. His son, Telemachus, barely remembers his father, and is powerless to stop any of it. The gods intervene. Athena, Odysseus' patron and protector, convinces Zeus to finally allow his return home. His journey has been delayed for years by the wrath of one god in particular, Poseidon, ruler of the sea, whose fury we'll come to understand very soon. The story then shifts back to Odysseus himself, mid-voyage, and begins recounting, often in his own words, told as a story within the story, everything that happened since Troy fell. It starts, almost immediately, with a warning sign. Odysseus and his men raid a coastal town belonging to the Cicons, allies of Troy. A moment of very human greed and overreach that cost them dearly. The Cicons counterattack and kill several of his men. It's a small but important detail. Odysseus is not a flawless hero. His own choices, again and again throughout this story, are part of what prolongs his suffering. Then comes the storm. Blown off course by fierce winds for 9 days, Odysseus with fleet arrived somewhere else entirely, the land of the Lotus-Eaters. Here, the danger isn't violence, it's contentment. The local inhabitants offer Odysseus' scouting party the lotus fruit. Anyone who eats it forgets home entirely, losing all desire to leave, wanting only to stay and eat more lotus forever. Odysseus has to physically drag his own crew back to the ships, weeping, and tie them to the rowing benches to force them back to sea. It's the first of many trials that isn't really about monsters. It's about the temptation to simply stop trying to go home, a theme that will return again and again and across this journey. The next island brings the most famous episode in the entire poem, and the moment that turns Odysseus' journey from difficult into cursed. Landing on an unfamiliar island, Odysseus and a small party of men explore a cave filled with cheese, milk, and livestock. They decide to wait for its owner, hoping for a guest gift, in keeping with the Greek custom of XENIA, sacred hospitality between host and stranger. It is, in hindsight, one of the worst decisions in the poem. The cave belongs to Polyphemus, a cyclops, a one-eyed giant, son of the sea god Poseidon. He returns, seals the cave with a boulder so massive that dozens of men couldn't move it. Instead of offering hospitality, he begins eating Odysseus' men, 2 at a time, for dinner. Trapped, Odysseus turns to the very trait that defines him, cunning over brute strength. He offers Polyphemus strong wine, and when the giant, drunk, asks his name, Odysseus tells him, "Nobody." Autis in the Greek, a pun that will matter enormously in a few minutes. Once Polyphemus passes out drunk, Odysseus and his remaining men drive a sharpened, fire-hardened stake into the giant's single eye, blinding him. When the other Cyclops outside ask who has hurt him, he shouts, "Nobody is hurting me!" And so, understandably confused, they leave him alone. It's one of the cleverest sequences in all of ancient literature, and it should have been a clean escape. Odysseus even gets his men out the next morning, hidden clinging to the bellies of Polyphemus' sheep, as the blind giant feels only their backs while letting them out to graze. But then Odysseus makes the single worst decision of the entire poem. As his ship pulls away to safety, he can't resist shouting back his real name. Boasting, claiming credit for the victory, unable to let his own cleverness go unrecognized. Polyphemus, now knowing exactly who blinded him, prays to his father, Poseidon, god of the sea, for revenge. That prayer is the reason the 10-year detour happens at all. Every storm, every wrong turn, every disaster from this point forward is Poseidon, making sure Odysseus' cleverness costs him everything he has. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it reframes the entire poem. The Odyssey isn't simply a hero's journey home. It's a study of the cost of pride, of a man whose greatest strength, his wit, is also, when unchecked, his greatest weakness. Odysseus' next stop seems, briefly, like salvation. AEOLUS, keeper of the winds, gives him an extraordinary gift. A leather bag containing every dangerous wind in the world, sealed shut, so that only a gentle breeze remains to guide his ships straight home. They sail for 9 days. Ithaca is in sight. And then Odysseus' own men, convinced the bag is secretly full of gold that their captain is hiding from them, open it while he sleeps. Every storm ever contained bursts out at once, blowing the fleet all the way back to AEOLUS' island. When Odysseus begs for help a second time, AEOLUS refuses, convinced now that a man so thoroughly cursed by the gods is beyond helping. It's a pattern that will recur throughout the poem. Home is close, and then it isn't. Not because of monsters, but because of very human failures. Greed, distrust, impatience, worse follows almost immediately. Landing among the LAESTRYGONIANS, a tribe of cannibal giants, Odysseus loses 11 of his 12 ships in a single ambush. Hundreds of men, gone in minutes, leaving him with only the crew of his own flagship. It's at this lowest point that the story turns toward its strangest chapter. The island of the sorceress, CIRCE. Circe transforms half of Odysseus' remaining men into pigs the moment they arrive. A literal transformation that scholars have long read as a metaphor. Men, losing their humanity to appetite and animal instinct. Odysseus, protected by a magical herb given to him by the god Hermes, resists her spell, and instead of becoming her victim, becomes, for an entire year, her guest and her lover. It's a full year Odysseus spends comfortably on Circe's island, essentially forgetting his mission entirely, until his own men finally remind him, Ithaca is waiting. And Circe, before releasing him, gives him one final chilling instruction. Before he can go home, Odysseus must do something no living man is supposed to do. He must travel to the land of the dead. The journey to the underworld, known to scholars as the Nikaia, is one of the strangest and most influential passages in Western literature. Odysseus doesn't die. He sails to the edge of the world, performs a ritual sacrifice, and calls the spirits of the dead to him. One at a time, they drink the blood of the offering and speak. The first spirit he meets is one of his own crew, Elpenor, who died falling drunk from Circe's roof just before they left, his body left unburied. Elpenor begs for a proper burial, a reminder that in this world dying isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Dying without ritual, without memory, without a name preserved, that is the true erasure. Then Odysseus speaks to the blind prophet Tiresias, who delivers the mission that will define the rest of the poem. Odysseus will make it home, but only if his men leave untouched a very specific herd of sacred cattle they will encounter later. Cattle belonging to the sun god, Helios. Touch them, Tiresias warns, and every single man will die before reaching Ithaca. Odysseus also meets his own mother, Anticlea, who died of grief, waiting for his return. A devastating scene in which he tries 3 times to embrace her ghost. And 3 times his arms close on nothing but air. And finally, he encounters the great heroes of the Trojan War itself. Achilles tells him famously that he would rather be a landless servant alive than king of all the dead. It's one of the most quietly radical lines in ancient literature. A direct rejection of the old heroic code that glory in death is worth more than a long, humble life. Coming from Achilles, the greatest warrior of the war, the line lands like a thunderclap. The underworld sequence isn't a detour. It's the thematic center of the entire poem, a meditation on memory, mortality, and what actually makes a life worth living. Set, deliberately, in the one place where the stakes of forgetting are made literal. Returning from the land of the dead, Odysseus faces the gauntlet of monsters that has become shorthand, in modern language, for any journey full of impossible choices. First, the Sirens, creatures whose song is so irresistible that it lures sailors to their deaths on the rocks. Surrounded, Homer tells us, by the bones of everyone who came before, Odysseus wants to hear the song and survive it. An impulse toward knowledge over safety that defines him throughout the poem. He has his men plug their ears with beeswax, then has himself tied tightly to the mast, ordering them not to release him no matter how much he begs. When the sirens sing, he does beg, desperately. And his men, unable to hear him, simply row on. Next comes one of the most famous impossible choices in all of literature. A narrow strait guarded on one side by Scylla, a 6-headed monster who will devour 6 men. And on the other by CHARYBDIS, a massive whirlpool that will swallow the entire ship if they sail too close. There is no way through unscathed. Circe had warned Odysseus in advance. Choose the loss of 6 men over the loss of everyone. It's a brutal necessary calculation. Heroism here, redefined not as saving everyone, but as making the least catastrophic choice when no good option exists. And then, the final trial Tiresias warned him about, the island of the sun, God's sacred cattle. Trapped by bad weather for a full month, running out of food, Odysseus' starving men finally break. While he sleeps, they slaughter some of the cattle to eat, gambling that the god will forgive them. He doesn't. The moment they set sail again, Zeus, at Helios' furious demand, destroys their ship with a lightning bolt. Every single man drowns. Everyone, except Odysseus. He alone survives, clinging to wreckage, and drifts for 9 days until he washes up, alone, exhausted, and now truly with nothing left. No ship, no crew, no men to command. Onto the shore of a nymph named CALYPSO. Calypso's island, Ogygia, is where the Odyssey actually begins. Chronologically, the point where we first meet Odysseus, before the poem loops backward through everything you've just heard. Calypso keeps Odysseus as a lover and a captive for 7 years, the longest single stretch of the entire story, offering him something extraordinary, immortality, if he stays with her forever and gives up Ithaca completely. And here's the detail that scholars consider the philosophical heart of the entire poem. Odysseus says no. He turns down eternal life with a goddess, on a paradise island, free from suffering, to return to a mortal wife, an aging kingdom, and a journey that has already killed every single man who sailed with him. It's a direct answer to the question the Iliad raised through Achilles. Is glory worth more than life? The Odyssey's answer is different and quietly radical. It isn't glory Odysseus wants at all. It's simply home. A specific, mortal, imperfect home, chosen freely over a perfect and eternal one. Joyce finally intervenes, ordering Calypso to release him. Odysseus builds a raft and sails on alone, until Poseidon, still furious, spots him and wrecks it in one final storm, leaving him to swim, half drowned, onto the shore of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians are, in many ways, the ideal audience. A wealthy, hospitable island people who treat the shipwrecked, nameless stranger with total generosity. No questions asked, exactly as XENIA demanded. It's here, at the royal court, that Odysseus finally reveals his identity and tells his own story, the entire flashback you've just heard, as after-dinner entertainment for a king. Moved by his account, the Phaeacians give him a ship, a crew, and enough treasure to make his return dignified. They sail him home while he sleeps and lay him, still sleeping, on the shore of Ithaca. 20 years after leaving for Troy, Odysseus is finally, physically, home. The story, however, is far from over. Ithaca isn't safe. More than 100 suitors occupy Odysseus' own halls, and arriving as a lone, weaponless king would mean certain death. Athena disguises him as an old broken beggar, unrecognizable even to those who loved him most. He goes first to Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who doesn't recognize his own king, but offers the disguised beggar food and shelter anyway. The poem's clearest demonstration of XENIA, hospitality offered freely, with nothing gained in return. Exactly the value the suitors have spent the entire poem violating. His son Telemachus, meanwhile, now a young man, having sailed off in search of news of his father, returns to Ithaca and is reunited with him at Eumaeus' hut. Athena briefly restores Odysseus' true appearance, and father and son recognize each other for the first time since Telemachus was an infant. Together, they begin planning the suitor's downfall. Odysseus, still disguised, makes his way into his own home as a beggar, and endures, in silence, the abuse of the men who have spent years consuming his wealth and pursuing his wife. He is mocked, insulted, and even struck, forced to absorb it all without revealing who he is. And then comes one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire poem. Argos, Odysseus' dog, now old, neglected, lying on a dung heap, waiting for a master everyone else believes is dead, is the only living creature in the entire kingdom who recognizes him instantly, purely by scent. Faithful, even after 20 years, he lifts his head, wags his tail, and dies, having finally seen his master return home. Odysseus, in disguise, has to turn away and hide his tears, unable to react without giving himself away. It's a single small scene, barely a few lines in the original Greek. And it's remembered, 3,000 years later, as one of the most emotionally powerful moments in all of literature. Penelope, meanwhile, has spent 20 years resisting remarriage with her own version of cunning that mirrors her husband's. For years, she told the suitors she would choose a new husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud, and then secretly unwove it every night, buying herself time, until the trick was finally discovered. Now, cornered, she sets a final challenge. Whoever can string Odysseus' old hunting bow, a bow so powerful no one else has ever managed to draw, and shoot an arrow through the aligned handle holes of 12 axe heads in a row, will win her hand. One by one, the suitors try and fail, unable even to string it. Then the disguised beggar asks for a turn, mocked and insulted by the suitors for his presumption. Given the bow almost as a joke, Odysseus strings it instantly, effortlessly, and fires the arrow clean through all 12 axe heads without a single wasted motion. Before the suitors can process what they've just seen, he turns the bow on them. What follows is the bloodiest sequence in the poem. Odysseus, Telemachus, and 2 loyal servants, barricading the doors, slaughter over 100 suitors in the Great Hall. Men who spent years consuming his household, insulting his family, and in this mortal universe, violating the sacred laws of hospitality so completely that their deaths are framed not as excessive, but as justice, finally arriving. Even now, recognition doesn't come easily. Penelope, wary after 20 years of grief and deception, refuses to simply believe a strange man's claim to be her husband. She tests him, asking a servant to move their marriage bed out of their bedroom. Odysseus reacts with genuine fury. The bed, he says, cannot be moved. He built it himself, around a living olive tree, rooted permanently into the ground. A secret only the real Odysseus could know. It's only at that moment, not his appearance, not his story, but this single unmovable, unshakable detail, that Penelope finally, fully believes. It's a quietly perfect final test. After 20 years of disguises, tricks, and false identities, what finally proves who Odysseus really is isn't a scar or a story. It's something rooted, something that cannot be uprooted or faked. The poem closes with a final threat of civil war, as the suitors' grieving families rise up against Odysseus for the killings. Athena herself steps in to force a lasting peace, ending the poem not with further bloodshed, but, finally, with quiet. 20 years after leaving for a war he didn't start, Odysseus is home. Truly home. For most of modern history, scholars assumed the Trojan War, and everything connected to it, was pure invention. A beautiful story, with no historical basis whatsoever. That assumption broke in the 1870s, when a controversial self-taught German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, using Homer's own descriptions almost like a treasure map, he began excavating a mound called Hisarlik on the coast of modern-day Turkey. He found a real city. In fact, he found many. Archaeologists have since identified at least 9 distinct layers of settlement, stacked on top of each other at Hisarlik, spanning thousands of years, one rebuilt on the ruins of the last. One of these layers shows clear signs of violent destruction by fire. Dated to roughly the 12th century BCE, tantalizingly close to when a Trojan War, if one occurred, would have taken place. This does not prove that Achilles was real, or that a wooden horse ever existed. What it does confirm is that Troy itself was a real, wealthy, strategically vital city, sitting exactly where Homer says it sat, controlling exactly the kind of trade route through the Dardanelles that would be worth a coalition of kings going to war over. Later discoveries include Hittite diplomatic records mentioning a city called Walusa, very likely the same place under its other name, Ios. They also mention conflicts involving a people called the ARCHAEOLOGY, widely believed to be the Mycenaean Greeks. These discoveries add further weight to the idea that some real conflict, or series of conflicts, may have inspired the tradition. The most likely picture, according to most historians today, isn't a single 10-year war fought exactly as Homer describes it. It's centuries of raiding, trade disputes, and small conflicts along this contested coastline, gradually compressed by oral tradition into one legendary war with one legendary cause. Fought by one legendary generation of kings, the Odyssey itself is even harder to pin to a real map. Ancient Greeks themselves debated where Odysseus actually traveled. Some later writers even placed his journey in the western Mediterranean, near Italy and Sicily. Most modern scholars believe the geography is intentionally fantastical. Not a real travel log, but a mythic geography, representing the edges of the known world. Where anything might be true, what we can say with confidence is this: the world underneath the myth was entirely real. Bronze Age of Greece, the fall of Troy, and the long, dangerous sea routes connecting the ancient Mediterranean. Homer didn't invent that world. He inherited it from centuries of memory and gave it a story worth remembering. Strip away the monsters, and the Odyssey is built on 3 Greek concepts that shape almost every scene we've covered. The first is nostos, homecoming. Not simply arriving somewhere, but returning specifically to where you belong. It's the root of the modern word nostalgia, literally the pain of homecoming, or the ache of its absence. Nearly every trial in this poem, from the LOTUS-EATERS to CALYPSO's island, is a variation on the same threat. Comfort, pleasure, or immortality itself, offered in exchange for giving up the specific mortal imperfect place you actually belong. The second is XENIA, sacred hospitality. The ancient Greek belief that how you treat a stranger at your door is a direct reflection of how you honor the gods themselves. Every major crisis in the poem is, at its core, a violation of XENIA. Polyphemus eating his guests instead of feeding them, the suitors consuming Odysseus' household instead of respecting it. Every act of true virtue in the story is XENIA honored. Eumaeus feeding a beggar he doesn't recognize. The Phaeacians rescuing a stranger with nothing, expecting nothing in return. The third, and most defining, is METIS, cunning intelligence. Not brute strength, not simple bravery, but the specific kind of adaptive, strategic cleverness that lets Odysseus escape a giant by inventing a pun, survive CIRCE by trusting a herb over fear, and win an unwinnable archery contest through patience and disguise instead of force. It's this trait, more than any other, that separates Odysseus from Achilles, the hero of the Iliad. Achilles' strength taken to its absolute limit. Odysseus' intelligence taken to its absolute limit. The fact that Greek civilization gave equal, if not greater, weight to the second kind of heroism tells us something important about what that civilization actually valued. Taken together, these 3 ideas, the ache to return home, the sacred duty to strangers, and the value of cleverness over force, form something close to an ethical framework. Not a religion, not a legal code, but a shared cultural instinct about what a good life and a good society actually looks like. That is, in many ways, exactly what a myth is for. The influence of the Odyssey didn't end in ancient Greece. It barely began there. Roughly 7 centuries later, the Roman poet Virgil, writing under the Emperor Augustus, used the Odyssey as a direct model for the first half of his own epic, the Aeneid. Following a wandering hero, Aeneas, across the Mediterranean toward a promised homeland, borrowing entire structural beats from Homer's poem to help build Rome's own founding myth. In the medieval period, Dante placed Odysseus, under his Latin name Ulysses, deep in hell in his Divine Comedy, not as a man who longed for home, but as a man consumed by insatiable hunger for knowledge. who sailed past the edge of the known world simply because he couldn't stop exploring. It's a striking reinterpretation, one that says as much about Dante's era as it does about Homer's. In 1922, the Irish writer James Joyce published Ulysses, one of the most influential novels of the 20th century, mapping the entire structure of Homer's epic onto a single ordinary day in Dublin, suggesting that the extraordinary journey of the Odyssey is, in some form, hidden inside every completely ordinary human life. And in the 20th century, the scholar Joseph Campbell studied the Odyssey as one of the founding examples of what he called the hero's journey, a narrative pattern he argued recurs across nearly every human culture. Departure, trial, transformation, and return. That pattern, consciously or not, now sits underneath the structure of countless modern films, novels, and franchise. 3,000 years after it was first sung aloud by a fireside poet with no name, we can confirm the Odyssey is still, in some form, being told, reshaped over and over into whatever a new civilization needs it to mean. So why does a story about a shipwrecked king still matter 3,000 years later? Because underneath the giants and the sirens, the Odyssey isn't really about the extraordinary. It's about a man who is given the chance to become a god and chooses instead to become simply human again, flawed, aging, mortal, and finally, home. Every civilization since has told some version of this same story, because every civilization eventually asks the same question Homer's audience was asking, gathered around a fire on the edge of a rebuilt, half-forgotten world. After everything is lost, what actually remains worth fighting to get back to? Homer's answer, 3,000 years ago, was simple. Not glory, not immortality, just home, however small, however imperfect, however far away it might be. Just home. This has been Stratopost, where history meets strategy.